Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. We are live here on Thursday for another week of This Week in Drones. Thanks, Michelle, for cueing the music. Really happy to be here to talk about a really important topic, of course, that is how drones are impacting the utility market, the utility world, and bringing us into the future. And brought a friend in the industry and an expert in that particular space, Kyle Miller with Censys Technologies. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. This is a better topic than last week for me to speak on intelligently. Not that I couldn't speak on public safety by any stretch, but sounds like what we're going to talk about today is much more my world. So appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And then we're going to hit a couple topics today, but wanted to remind everybody that since we're live, we love it when we get comments, questions, thoughts as you're typing away and interacting on here. We see all those pop up, and it keeps us excited, motivated, and it keeps the conversation, going deeper and being more practical for all you out there. So as we tackle questions on, how utilities are using drones for inspections, for surveying, for deliveries, how they're using different form factors of drones. Censys obviously has, right, I don't want to speak too much to your technology, but a nice fixed wing with props and other elements. And there's probably other models that are being used out there with quadcopters and who knows, all that world that you can speak to and tell stories around. It's going to be great. So as we get started, if you guys are out there ready to comment, I'd love to hear from you a quick one or two lines about how you're using drones for utilities, or just what your exposure is to that. Like you didn't have a clue that was going on, or you see that every day, or you're part of a company that does that. We'd love to just get like a pulse of who's out there listening so we can make this relevant. I will also say that we're excited to see you guys in person at the Energy Drone and Robotics Conference. It's coming up here on the 16th through the 18th in Houston. And we do have $200 off registration for friends of the podcast here. As you can see down there at the bottom of my screen, if you go to thisweekindrones.com/connect, you can get the coupon, get $200 off there and come meet with me. Kyle as well will be there. Matt Sloan, who's obviously one of the besties here on the podcast, he'll be there as well. Unfortunately, we won't see Brandon and Michelle this time around, but I just wanted to double click on that, go to that landing page and check out, the resources there, and then, get that $200 off, and hopefully we'll see you there. So with all that said, Andrew Bowen, thanks for your comments on how you're using electrical and LiDAR and thermal. Thank you so much. Anyone else, please send those in. All right. With that, I'm David Lewin, your host. I wanted to hand it to, I'm going to hand it to Brandon for a brief intro, Kyle for a brief intro, and then Michelle for an intro, and kicking off the first topic from Michelle, if you don't mind. So yeah, Brandon, go for it.
All right. Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. Brandon Youngblood, former FAA manager of the UAS Security and Counter UAS office, and now the co-founder and CEO of Drone Security Services. Appreciate it.
Yep. Kyle Miller, Director of Sales for Censys Technologies. Focused primarily on beyond visual line of sight enablement, both from the aircraft side, from the training side, from the regulation and policy side. And then one thing we'll talk about a little bit today is actually the workforce development side as well, to kind of scale some of these programs. So I spend most of my time in electric utilities, state government as well, but about 80% of my time spent scaling electric use cases, both from vegetation, transmission, and distribution operations. So yeah, hopefully looking forward to contributing.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. Go for it.
Michelle Duquette here from 3MAD, Michelle and Duquette Air, new consulting firm. I'd like to start us off today talking about, the elephant in the room, and that's the Ukrainian drone attack on Russian air assets and the significant, massive destruction that those drones caused. Not that I want to talk about that political environment at all, but I do want to tie that back to a thread that we've been having just about every podcast, and that is the inability to awaken people to the extent of the drone threat that we are not prepared for yet. So if you imagine that That could have been an energy plant. It could have been a nuclear power plant. It could have been the energy grid in the Northeast. It could have been a number of things that would cripple us, like literally cripple us. When we made reference, David was talking about this earlier before we came online, we make reference to the New Jersey sightings, and there was a lot of crazy talk. And there was someone that was saying it was an Iranian warship that was out in the water, that was sending drones in over New Jersey. And while, we kind of chuckled at that, think about that within the context of this most recent attack. Is it so far-fetched that a container ship brings a container, it gets put on a flatbed on an 18-wheeler and gets trucked somewhere, and at any moment, those doors open up and a swarm of drones come out and do some significant damage somewhere? We are not prepared for that. So I think that there is credibility in us kind of going down all of those rabbit holes and thinking through, even if it's ridiculous, how would we defend ourselves from something like that? The current legislation is talking about, they're struggling with, authorities to state, local, tribal, and territorial authorities. But when you put a scenario like that on the table, it seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? We have got to do better. So I just wanted to bring that up within the context of awakening. Today we're going to talk more about, the utility world and how folks like Kyle are using drones both on the security side and, on the drones as an asset in his mission. But we always need to be thinking more about that realm of the possible that's out there, that threat, and what are we going to do about it?
Absolutely. And I think it's kind of like the two sides of the coin when it comes to drones and utilities. There's obviously amazing uses for good, as Kyle's going to help highlight here in a minute. And then there's the risk, the threat of drones to utilities, and the importance of like NERC SIP for electric utilities, their security requirements being updated eventually. As an example, the need for that to include drones. And what are they going to do? They need to be able to look up. They can't just defend their, fences and their borders and kind of, make it so that you can't shoot a gun through the fence. Well, that's important, but you could just zip a drone right over top of it after you've spent, millions of dollars hardening it. So it's just food for thought and really important to kind of recognize. I don't know if Brandon, do you have any comments on that? And then I'll, otherwise we'll kind of move into the drones for good space, which was the goal today. But any thoughts just on acknowledgement?
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about this, and the hard part for me. So I've been using drones lethally for almost 22 years, and then so I was on the offensive side and surveillance on the military and doing a lot of that stuff, and then I switched to defending against drones when ISIS kind of wrote the playbook on how to use drones in an offensive manner. And it's very, very scary knowing those capabilities and what they can do. And I will be frank, in the lack of reliability of the current counter UAS technology that it exists out there. And then, then you incorporate the fact that they can operate in a civil environment and inflict a credible amount of harm and destruction. It's the potential is very real. So we should never take that for granted. Any technology that's ever been developed can be used for nefarious reasons, purposes, etc. I mean, even cars now are potentially weapons, and who would have even thought about ramming cars into people for harm? So it's very scary. We should not, as Michelle kind of alluded to, stick our hands or our head in the dirt and ostrich this. We have to deal with it. We have to figure out a way to leverage both the great capabilities and advantages that drones bring to us in a very positive way, but also not be naive to the fact that they can versely be used in a very negative and bad way. So that's why I kind of let the military or the Fed was to bring that knowledge and capability out, both integration and on the securing against drone threat side. So that's about it.
So just before we transition, I wanted to acknowledge, Zev, Nadler, thanks for your comment and the message you've been preaching, and the shout out to Michelle. I think we're on the same page with that. And then Andrew, you originally messaged that, you're using, you said electrical with LiDAR and thermal. I'd love to hear more about that. And then you also followed up with the fear of drones is completely real. So we do see both sides, and I think both sides are really important. And then just Ed Knock, shout out. And he mentioned the fragility of the U.S. grid, how fragile it is, and not understanding the impact of it is a big deal, right?
And if I may, David, the other thing I just want to throw out there, this also highlights the importance of compliance, especially with remote ID, so that these organizations who protect those critical infrastructure space, they can identify who is operating in compliance with the regulations, because at that point you can not 100% guarantee that they're not a threat, but you can, for the most part, say, all right, with a high level of confidence, that is not something I need to really worry about. It's someone that's in compliance with the regulations. They're most likely doing not a nefarious thing to the grid, which eases people down and lowers the hype train that we saw in New York and New Jersey. So compliance is incredibly important. And then just to highlight the grid issue a little bit more. So there was that FBI notice that they arrested a person who was planning an attack on a grid station. I think it was a substation in Tennessee. And so it's real. And the only reason why that they were able to catch him was because the guy tried to buy or sell some drones or something to an undercover FBI agent. That's it. That's the only way that attack stopped. So we're getting lucky, and eventually our luck's going to run out. And hopefully we will be able to respond quickly and accordingly and bounce back quick.
Absolutely. All right. Well, go ahead, Michelle. Yep. And then after this comment, we'll transition. Go for it.
Okay. This also leads us to that critical need of interoperability. I know you guys out there, you're hearing me say it every podcast and probably every conversation we all have in person. And I'm not done yet, because I don't think enough people are hearing it. But if we don't focus on interoperability standards, interoperability within the technology, but also within the communities, within the TTPs, we are shortchanging those people who are going to be the ones that are standing there in the 11th hour as this swarm comes in. So please, 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 if you're involved in whatever you're involved in with drone tech, drone policy making, acquisition, whatever it is, please prioritize interoperability so that we're able to leverage the assets that are out there. This is excellent technology that's available to us. We need to be able to allow others to use it when it's their turn to be in the hot seat. We can't keep on with the proprietary solutions. All right, I'm off my soapbox.
Sweet. All right, guys. Well, appreciate the thoughts. And Kyle, I don't know if I really forewarned you. We were going to deep dive into that when you signed up, but I'm going to switch gears and pull up the graphic that we used to announce this. That was kind of a fun little conversion of the little logo drone into the Censys, one of your drones. And Kyle, I'd love for you to speak to this. I'll just play it a couple times so people can see it, but it, transformed magically on the graphic, thanks to AI. Into one of your tools for the trade. So anyway, I figured I'd kick that off. I'll remove that and just let you kind of take it away, Kyle. Just kind of share a little bit more about what you guys do and just the context, because people out there are joining this to learn, and to learn about how they can do more beyond visual line of sight operations and get waivers. I know you're really skilled with that. They want to learn, the various types of drones that are available and what missions they're really set up for. They want to learn about airspace awareness tools, whether it's radar or ADS-B or remote ID or cameras or whatever else you're seeing out there. So, we can kind of go into any of those spaces ultimately. And as people are out there typing questions in, we're shifting gears from that security conversation more into this enablement side of how to use drones for inspections, for other things, for you, on behalf of utilities. So send in your questions and comments on that. Kyle, I'll let you kind of take it away and we'll ask some questions from there.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, I don't know how you take a still image like my headshot and turn it into like a video of me turning around and smile. That was cool when you sent that over. So kudos to you for that. I'm sure it was probably pretty easy, but some of that, ironically, some of that tech stuff goes over my head, but which is going to be funny considering the things I'll be talking about over the course of the next few minutes.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean, when we're talking about utilities and kind of how they, where they're at now, I always like to start with kind of where they were when I started in the industry, which is about 8 years ago. What was the state of the union? Who was flying? Who was doing what? I think back in 2018, I remember there being an operation, whether it was part of a Beyond program or anything like that, kind of these isolated test site sandboxes. I think back to when Ameren, again, don't quote me on anything I say today, but I do come at it with a little bit of experience. I believe it was Ameren. They did a 60-mile back in 2018 is obviously quite impressive. I don't even remember what they flew, but a lot of human personnel serving as visual observers, serving as, in some ways, those were your airspace awareness tools, was the human visual observer, which is in all intents and purposes still a strategy today. Not to say that it's better than others. It's totally use case dependent and whatnot, but the human VO is still a way to mitigate risk. It's one that I think the industry is trying to get away from pretty in earnest, which has a lot of merit in that. There's a lot of other tools that, aren't hungover, that aren't tired, that don't blink, whether it's radar or cameras, to your point, or ADS-B in tracking compliant aircraft. There's a lot of solutions for airspace awareness that aren't humans, but I think back to that mission, and it was kind of groundbreaking at the time. Now that is a very, very benign operation, the 60-mile flight, if you will, when you're talking about a fixed wing or something like that. But when we talk about BVLOS, the utilities are really the ones that are spearheading a lot of adoption and use case development for platforms like ours and others. BVLOS is not a Censys thing. It's something that Censys focuses on a ton, but it is not exclusive to us by any stretch of the imagination. We have pilots at Censys that were military UAS pilots prior to their commercial career, after they transitioned out. And they get a little bit of a kick out of how much we talk and praise BVLOS this and BVLOS that, because that was their day job 20 years ago. We have a pilot that's got 1,500 combat hours. He's our flight ops director. He's got 1,500 combat hours. I believe and I'm not a veteran in any stretch, so I believe the phrase is warheads on foreheads. That was his career before doing some DOI flying, and then now with Censys. So, we talk a lot about BVLOS as like we're the experts, but really it's been commonplace for quite some time. But scaling it at a capability and a price point commercially, I think, is a very different problem. In the national airspace, around other GA, that is really the challenge that the industry is trying to solve, and Censys is one of the key players in that. But we focus really, really heavily on that capability per dollar. It's very easy to throw a lot of people, humans, at a problem and have a bunch of VOs and all this, but that doesn't scale. It's very easy to throw, crewed aviation at every problem. Helicopters do a lot in the electric utility industry that, frankly, they don't need to do. There's a lot that drones can't replace helicopters for. We will be the first to tell you that. I will be specifically. But there's a lot of patrol work. There's a lot of vegetation encroachment flying, that they're doing that can and are actively being replaced by UAS.
Kyle, do you mind to speak to that just for people's context or awareness? What would be one or two examples where a helicopter is more efficient or the better tool than a drone in inspection?
Well, I used to say string and wire, but I'm seeing not a lot, but I'm seeing successful use cases with UAS pulling and string and wire. I would have historically said that would be kind of reserved for the traditional helicopter operation. I think there's still coverage and speed benefits to crewed aviation. Last year we did a pilot project. I won't name the utility, but it was a 100-mile transmission line. And this was before we launched the new aircraft that can fly 100 miles. The previous generation flew 40. That was our basically a 1 hour endurance at 45 miles an hour. A little bit of a buffer. We had a 40-mile range. It would have taken us roughly 2 or 3 flights, depending on where you stage, set up, launch, land, etc., to fly that 100-mile transmission line after a storm. It was a critical 100-mile stretch that gets flown immediately after every storm. And a helicopter does that in one flight. If you care about speed, the drone is not a tool for that use case for that line. So those are instances, obviously dropping workers off to go do work on high voltage transmission line. The Centera 6 ain't dropping anybody off at the top of a 500 kV structure anytime soon. So there's different applications there, and I think about all the routine patrols that happen, on a 1,300, 1,400 an hour, whatever these rates are, to get an R44 out there to have a human looking out the right and tagging encroachments on an iPad. Man, there's a better way. There really is just a better way. And I think that's only a true statement as of about 18 to 24 months ago, and it's more true now than it was 24 months ago. But I think to say that the industry, the technology, and the regulations were ready more than 2 years ago is probably a bit of a stretch. But we have the luxury now of seeing what our customers are doing. And it truly is flying routine, 20, 30, 40, now with the new aircraft, up to 80 to 90 mile missions one way, and competing from a coverage perspective and a data quality perspective with traditional helicopter operations. So we're really, really starting to see that kind of shift. As we work with some of these utilities, we also have the benefit of working with their contracted entities. And one of the things that you mentioned as well, Michelle, was interoperability standards. So that got my brain going towards standardization in general, and standardization from an operations and training perspective. That is something that's stalling us as an industry pretty, from an enterprise adoption perspective. We have distribution business units doing their own thing, transmission business units doing their own thing, the storm vendors. It is the Wild West because it's gray skies operations, and that's its own set of challenges. Mm-hmm. Renewables doing their own thing, telecom doing their own thing. It is, for all intents and purposes, still a work in progress to standardize. And not every utility is the Wild West. There's a lot with very robust standards and programs in place, and ATC in place. I go to the PG&E conference every year, and to see what they have in place from an air traffic organization internally to PG&E that manages fixed wing flights, helicopter flights, contractor flights for helicopters, for drones, for all this. And then all of these different vendors that are contracting with them, hundreds of crews flying. I don't know if it's Mavics anymore for them, but whatever they fly around, Parrots and all these other things, managing hundreds of flights a day in their airspace, I think is pretty impressive. And then there's still utilities on the complete opposite side, which, still have a drone guy, and that's their drone program. So
that's great, man. That's a great tee up. Out of curiosity, Michelle, do you have a comment on that?
I have so many comments. I think first and foremost, though, the story that we're hearing from Kyle right now, we've heard this before, haven't we? We've heard this from the public safety community. They have a broad stretch of maturity levels on DFR programs. DFR programs are popping up all over the place. Now, the FAA has come through and heard and worked with that community to the point where they've improved the waiver process. And it's easier now. It makes more sense now to the people who need to apply for these waivers, for the people who are trying to get a drone as a first responder program in place. So we have more of them popping up, and they really define things based on their tribal knowledge in that chair, in that geographical area. And it's a challenge. We're starting to see many different flavors of drone as a first responder across the United States now. I'm hearing the same kind of story from Kyle now, where he is starting to see that there are different levels of maturity in training, in standards development, which is going to lead to tactics, techniques, and procedure differences. So we need to get a handle on this. How do we do that, Kyle, for your environment?
It's a good question. Really, the utilities that, let's take a utility that's 80% externally contracting work out and 20% handling work internally. A lot of the time when we work with the service side of the house, not the internal utility, but the contractors, they get very concerned that as the utility buys technology, hires more pilots, cross trains, upskills and reskills existing workers to do some flying themselves, that they're going to be kind of kicked to the wayside. But really what I try and harp to people, and this is something I have jotted down to talk about today, is that technology adoption by a utility is an opportunity, not just for the ratepayer, but also for the vendors that contract with them. Mm-hmm. Because if you are standardized in the same approach, let's say you're ISBEO, let's say your bars, whatever your level of compliance is, that is an opportunity to contract with that utility and remain standardized with their approach to aviation. A lot of these utilities have corporate flight departments that set those standards, and I think that's a really, really good place to start. But we still work with some utilities that have debates on whether drones live in aviation, whether they live in IT, whether they live in distribution, whether they live in transmission. So there's still that disparity. But I think there's a desire for standards, which I think is really important. Starting there is a fundamentally good place to be. And very rarely do we run into, screw those guys, we're going to do what we want to do. It doesn't really, we don't really run into that. We do still run into clusters from time to time that operate in silos and whatnot, but there is a desire for standards. I always say we're out of the education phase when it comes to what UAS. Let me rephrase that. We are not in the education phase where we're trying to convince drones are viable tools. We're well out of that phase as a commercial UAS industry. We are still very much in the phase of how can they be deployed at scale and what solutions are best versus others. I think that's still very much where we're at. But we're not convincing anyone to give it a try or to stand up a program or to do this and that. And where we're at in that adoption curve, I think, is really in that kind of early adoption or kind of early majority, where most of these places have programs and most of them want a strong standardized approach to deploying the technology. Do they have the workforce? Do they have budget? Do they have a use case that fits certain types of tools? I think it's its own question.
Question on that, and then Brandon, I'll let you speak to the ADSB question as well here in a second. I just wanted to tag off of what you're just saying, Kyle. Where it sounds like a lot of people are widely adopting this. There was a conversation going on in the comments that I wanted to bring up between a couple of people. Ed mentioned that California is unique in the electrical space, are organized and focused, and then Andrew, throughout the wildfire, this incident in California, that he said changed everything in California when the drone hit the super scooper. I want to see just what your thoughts are on, do incidents like that actually slow the industry down? Do you actually see that, on your end with customers? Does it not slow the industry down, but maybe cause more conversations around policy and training and, to where what you guys were just talking about? Does it help drive demand for that, establishing better program? What does it do to the industry really?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts there. I actually think that wildfire changed Andrew's last comment there, I think actually has two valid statements in it. In one, the wildfire changed everything in California is a standalone valid statement. That kicking off the Dire program and having hundreds of crews out, that really grew up PG&E's UAS program very quickly. Now they truly are one of the most robust UAS programs out there. Again, not just the internal side, but the external side, and then how they mix crewed and uncrewed aviation in the same airspace for a common mission, I think is unique. There are a lot of utilities that are certainly trending in that direction, and I have been doing very good work for several years. But yeah, I think it's a fair statement to say California is unique in the electrical space because of that. They are incredibly organized. They're incredibly focused because they have to be. They cannot afford another 2018. They cannot afford another billions of dollars worth of lawsuits and damages and homeowner settlements and legal fees. And, that is not something that wants to be repeated. And that's a reason why there's policy driving wildfire mitigation plans and energy investment into new materials and PSPS programs and reducing the wildfire risk to the grid and to homeowners. So I think that's very true. The other thing you hit on there, Brandon.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kyle. Michelle, do you have to drop right now? Okay. You have to drop this millisecond. Do you want to say a final statement or anything?
Yeah, I just put a little note in chat. Guys, this is a really important discussion. And this discussion is fundamental and conveys across multiple sectors. So please keep having the discussion. Please keep putting your questions in and challenging what we're saying so that we can actually talk about the things that are either concerns or maybe we're not on the right vector. Keep that information coming and, keep the energy flowing. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle. Take care. All right, Kyle. Yeah, if you want to, I don't know if you remember what you were in the middle of saying, but
yeah.
and then
Well,
Brandon, I'll let you take the ADSB comment in a minute or when he's done. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think honestly, what I'm about to say is a great segue and back over to Brandon. But the super scooper comment, yeah, those types of incidents don't propel the industry forward, but I think they bring an awareness and a spotlight to what is an effective way to mitigate risks, both air and ground, below 400 feet or above. I think they bring that conversation to the forefront, which has a series of benefits. But then you go to, there's all those drone sightings in Jersey a couple months ago. If you have a nascent drone program in Jersey, whether you're the state police, whether you're a utility, and we do a lot of work up in New Jersey, especially up in the Northeast on critical infrastructure and other types of utilities and transportation, that certainly doesn't help. They certainly can't go and rapidly suggest putting a bunch of drones in the sky for good, right? For rail inspection, for road inspection, for public safety. Essentially, they can't make that proposal to say, let's go buy 100 new aircraft across the Commonwealth, or whether it's Massachusetts or Jersey, and put more drones in the sky that more people are going to shoot at, more people are going to post on Instagram and Twitter or X or whatever. That's certainly not a benefiting factor of these types of incidents, but I do think they bring an important conversation to the forefront. And I think it's a conversation, from what I know about Brandon, one that he's pretty incredibly involved in.
That's a really, really good point, Brandon. I'll let you speak to that and the ADSB comment. I'll highlight you here for a second as you're talking here. You don't like that? Okay, you can. I think you're muted still. I lost your sound.
There we go.
There you are.
Yeah, no, it's like when they were complaining about all the high resolution digital stuff in the movie making industry. They're like, well, now you can actually see my skin and it's all not like phased up and everything. It's like in my face. No, it's Kyle hit the nail on the head with the perspective and societal acceptance. And, there are a lot of people out there looking for a reason to kill the technology, and stuff like that is what happens. And that's what gives them the ammo. I mean, it's like I pulled it up, but it's Representative Tim Burchett's bill that goes out there and says if a drone's flying over your house and you have reason to believe that it's a threat to you, you can shoot it down with a shotgun. It literally says that in the law, that you can shoot down a drone with a shotgun. Now, imagine I have a railroad right not too far from my house, and let's say they're doing an inspection on that rail line, and my crazy neighbor on the other side who borders that rail line's like, oh, that's flying over my house, when actually it's probably not, and he starts shooting at it. That's the kind of thing, and that's the compliance issue. We've got to be compliant. We've got to get there so that he does it. Ironically, the same neighbor owns like 6 drones, and he flies them all the time and has none of them registered or anything. And I love him to death, but kind of been a little slow on the uptake sometimes. But yeah, and then I saw Andrew's note on, please hit on ADSB. I'm curious what exactly you meant by that on the ADSB front. If it's drone adoption of ADSB, I'll tell you right now, it'll never happen. There's a spectrum space issue, which is preventing ADSB from being adopted into drones. So there's a scalability issue. And once you start attaching and broadcasting out on those frequency sets, it gets cluttered, and then you start losing the Part 121, the commercial air traffic signals. So ADSB will never go on drones. It's just not going to happen. They explicitly prohibited it, and when they released Part 89, and so it just won't. And it's 1 second. So let me just finish this one thought. And it's purely a physics-based issue. This is just, there's not enough spectrum space to allow it. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that it's not a great solution. It just won't happen. Kyle, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question. What is your take, Brandon, and Dave, because this is your space too. What is your take on UAS operating under high altitude waiver? Let's say they're operating at 600, 800, 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet. We have a customer operating at 1,500 feet. What's your take on their worthiness to transmit ADS-B. They don't, right, in compliance with that. What's your take on their worthiness to show up on the map?
I mean, so I don't think ADS-B is going to be the answer because there's already too much traditional air traffic that's exponentially growing and whatever. There are other signals and other spectrum spaces I know for a fact that they're looking at. The other thing, remote ID will never be used for separation purposes. It just can't comply with the latency requirements and the positional accuracy. I think it's like within 100 feet or something like that. It needs to be accurate in. That'll never work. So I know I can't say what, but I know inside the FAA they are exploring different types of broadcasts that are naturally in drones that are being used when direct communication. Because it does provide some of the accuracy requirements that they're looking for. So hopefully we'll see something out there soon at some point. The best bet, I think, again, is either detect and avoid or some type of ground-based sense and avoid. We've got to get the cost down for it to be scalable, but there's a lot of states. North Dakota's a big one. New York's got one that are doing, and I know this is a kind of a faux pas word, but corridors. I know it's a terrible word, but setting up those ground-based sense and avoids that it can be checked out to provide that surveillance separation, not necessarily maybe the drone has to be due to the limited radar cross sections and biologicals and all that other stuff that you have to filter out, but it can say, hey, there's an aircraft here doing this, you need to avoid it, and put that responsibility back on there with a checked out detect system of some sort. ADS-B on military aircraft, again, never happened. The second you put ADS-B out on military aircraft, China, Russia, all of our adversaries know where every single piece of military equipment are that we have flying anywhere in the United States. They can put together pattern of life. They can put together, where what systems are stationed in what bases throughout the world. So it'll never happen. I know the midair at DCA, this got brought up by NTSB, but the NTSB has no power to tell the DoD what to do. And the DoD will never, ever broadcast ADS-B out as a requirement unless they want people to know where they are, which is possible, but very unlikely. So that's gone. So again, that's why it was so challenging. And that's why we don't have an integration rule out for the last 20 years. I did a comment recently that there was, some concern about the exodus of FAA leadership. I personally don't think it's that bad of a thing. I mean, let's get a fresh new look at some of the leadership roles that are in the FAA. When I was in, about 60 to 65% of all SESs in the FAA were eligible for retirement. Let's get some new blood, young blood, in there, and maybe direct in a different way, look at things in a different way that haven't been looked at before. So I'm really hoping to see some new stuff. We'll see what's in a Part 108 rule when it comes out. I'm reluctant to talk about it because one of my folks were on that rulemaking team. But it'll happen. It's just a matter of when, how, and what that's going to look like.
What do you think, Kyle? Yeah, I can see your gears turning. I mean, what's your take? So and maybe give people context as well as to what exactly you guys do and why the things that Brandon spoke to matter or are relevant. It might be obvious to some, but probably there's people out there that don't know what Censys Technologies is exactly. You might want to frame that up.
So why are we in the enablement space? Well, because we're an aircraft manufacturer. So we want to design, produce, and sell aircraft. And there's other kind of parts of the business model, but to think about Censys bluntly and really simply, we've been an aircraft manufacturer for 9 years, producing vertical takeoff and landing fixed wings capable of beyond visual line of sight. So we need to be in the enablement space if we want to sell aircraft. That is pretty much the name of the game, right? And has been. Really, we're in the asset intelligence space now when it comes to the power grid, when it comes to waterways, when it comes to transportation systems and energy and other energy deliveries, whether it's pipeline or transmission or what have you. So we are incredibly heavy in the regulatory space. We've been writing all of our customers' BVLOS waivers since 2017. We write high altitude waivers. At some point, this is not the number anymore. I haven't done the math. I try not to do math in public, but we haven't done the math in a little bit. At one point, we were 25-ish of all the active BVLOS waivers in the country were waivers we wrote for our aircraft. So we're in the space. We have an investment. We have a reason to be invested in the future of enabling technologies like fixed wings and multi-rotors and ground sensors. And, these are customers that care a lot more about than just flying assets. So Brandon hit on Part 108, same thing, hesitant to speak on it for many reasons. I don't want to get hopes up or kill any hopes. But I think there's a reason to be optimistic about what Part 108 will allow for just across the board. Obviously, some industries, it's not going to do a ton for Censys right off the bat and our customers. Taking a crawl, walk, run approach towards implementing BVLOS rulemaking, chances are the initial rule will be less than what we've been getting customers waivers for a few years, for several years. So I think that's a very fair and valid way to approach rulemaking around advanced operations. I think we can draw a lot of parallels from Canada and what Transport Canada is allowing for sheltered operations, what we call shielded operations here in the States. That's a con-op that we've been kind of squeezing every ounce of flexibility out of, is shielded ops. It keeps costs down, but there's still no replacement for airspace awareness tools in certain use cases. There is no replacement. Shielded operations does not get to start replacing airspace awareness depending on the use case.
So can you explain for listeners what shielded operations is, what its limits are in terms of, height, all that, range, whatever it is, and then like the use cases where you would need to be, out in the NAS, out in open air.
Sure.
Yeah.
So shielded ops, and Brandon, help me out on when it even kind of first was introduced. I mean, it was introduced as a function of the ARC, but when did that? Our first shielded ops waiver was a 75-foot above structure waiver. Historically, the number was 50, right? If you had a request, a BVLOS waiver request, that meant that you weren't going to fly any higher than 50 feet above the nearest obstacles. So let's just, for sake of conversation, you're in the Sahara Desert. There's nothing around you. There's no obstacles around you. You can't fly higher than 50 feet off the ground. Now, obviously, most areas in the United States where you might be doing drone ops aren't the Sahara Desert. So typically in our use case, we are now, because we've grown that height over time, but starting at 75 feet or so at a 45-mile-an-hour clip in a fixed wing, suboptimal to be 75 feet off electrified assets. So we very quickly wanted to do what we could to prove a safety case to fly a little higher, still with no visual observer on the ground, just an RPIC and a sensor operator or secondary pilot, whatever, at the ground control station at the launch location, and then send the aircraft 100 miles away, land at the other end. Maybe you have a person with a rental car or whatever with a case to pack the drone up or swap a battery or do whatever. But we've cared very much about how to enable that. Shielded ops was an opportunity to do that. 75 wasn't great, so we had to prove some safety case in addition to that. People and property on the ground, air and ground risk. How can this combination of mitigations equal a safety case and an acceptable level of risk that gets an economic benefit to the enterprise or to the service provider or whoever? Our number now is 200 feet. So we are 200 feet above these assets. The shielded ops piece is not our only risk mitigations, but it's one of the biggest ones in our safety case. I think, I won't put Brandon on the spot and ask him to talk too much about what he thinks will be part of the crawl phase of implementing Part 108. But I know there's already a precedent for that with Transport Canada, which they call sheltered ops. So November 4th, Canada is going to be ripping shielded ops all over all the different provinces up there. So it's going to be an exciting thing for that market.
Now that 200 foot also rings a bell when it comes to the recent certificate of waiver for DFR programs, right? And so is that kind of what you're saying, like where you might imagine the next rulings kind of allowing that more broadly, to go up to 200 feet, or is it totally different than that? Or what are your, I don't know, thoughts on that? Is that what you're referring to? But you also mentioned flying much higher, like 1,000, 1,500 feet. So what's the differences there too?
Yeah. So the ops at 1,500 feet are typically under Part 91 COA, at least in our experience with our customers, that have other, mitigations associated with them. After emergency, it might be a TFR or what have you, but you can make a very strong argument that TFRs don't scale either. We got asked to fly a couple of years ago after Hurricane Ian. We got asked to fly for one of our telecom customers. They had some towers out in the barrier islands of Sanibel, Pine Island, and Captiva. And forgive me, I'm an East Coast of Florida guy, so West Coast of Florida, geographically illiterate. But those were the 3 barrier islands that got impacted from Hurricane Ian, one of the 3, or 3 of the many. And they asked us to fly like the day after the storm rolled through. It was probably, from what I heard, by the boots on the ground there, that was some of the busiest airspace and some of these folks, some of these emergency managers had ever been in their entire careers. You had Coast Guard operations, National Guard operations, local law enforcement. They were picking people off of roofs. This is the day after a Category 5 impacts the coast. And, believe it or not, little old Censys trying to get a TFR so we can launch from the mainland and go fly and look for down cell towers is probably not going to be an approach that gets a green light from the air boss down there in Southwest Florida. So you can make an argument that TFRs don't scale for reasons like that, because other aviation activity can't be grinded to a halt because of your inability to effectively operate around other aviation assets. So again, our focus is kind of blended. We do have to sell a solution and implement it ourselves from time to time. So we don't want something clunky or costly, because it's going to be hard to sell and hard to use. So we try and balance that capability per dollar ratio that I mentioned at the start of this to, implement it again ourselves, but also enable others to purchase and operate it themselves as well.
Now, curious on that, if flying over 200 feet, is enabled by other sensors, radars, other things, then is there in your world a business case for that dollar per mile or however that works to fly higher, or is 200 feet in your experience, pretty much giving the capability that the drones and the sensors have, providing, all that's needed, or is flying up above that up to 400 or even higher?
Yeah.
Do you, it's just, I don't know. How does that work? How do you do the math?
Our linear infrastructure customers are pumped about 200 feet because it keeps them close enough to the asset to get good data, high enough above the asset to be safe in mountainous terrain or rolling hills and things like that. If you're not a linear infrastructure, owner or operator, 200 feet is kind of limiting. It's hard to do wide area mapping at 200 feet AGL. There's a reason why Wolpert and NV5 have a fleet of manned aviation that goes around and flies the country every year at much higher altitudes with much better sensors, because it's a much more efficient way to do it. So again, that 1,500 foot use case out in the Northeast that I mentioned, that's to map the barrier islands for source water protection and simulating what a response would look like if Hurricane Sandy impacted that area again. How do we keep clean drinking water flowing? How do we, properly send resources to the most heavily impacted areas first instead of second or third? That flying higher gets you that information quicker. I think there's a big debate. We're not in the DFR space. We have public safety customers, but we're not entrenched in the DFR space like Skydio or Flock or, Axon or any of these providers. But I see on LinkedIn all the time the debate about 200 versus 400. It's folks working on and implementing different solutions, and there's altitudes that some folks are flying at and altitudes that some folks aren't, and they're having the debate about what's better, 200 or 400 feet. I'll let them debate that on LinkedIn. I see good reasons on both sides, but I think in a lot of ways altitude is your friend. But again, it all comes down to the use case, and our linear infrastructure customers are pumped about 200 feet.
Yep, that's good. Great real world scenarios, and you're nodding a lot, Brandon. So I guess you guys are speaking, same language.
Yeah, no, so when I first got started in the FAA, it was actually on the IPP program way back before they even codified it in law, and when it was an executive order. And so the shielded ops, that really started, the conversation really started there. And a lot of it was common sense, and it made sense to me as, an ops guy just trying to get the job done. Well, if I'm flying even in an urban environment, urban is actually a lot easier, because if I'm flying within 50 feet of or below the, altitude of the peaks of the buildings, why shouldn't I be able to fly? There are no helicopters going to be dodging buildings in New York City or Chicago or any of these others. So it was a logical explanation and something that, you know, I really appreciated. And I'll tell you really what happened inside the FAA is there was a changeover in people. And that's what enabled a lot of this stuff to happen, because again, it was a different thinking, it was a different mindset, it was more creative solution finding rather than just, well, you can't tell me an aircraft's going to be there because you can't prove that an aircraft's not going to be there because there's no data behind it. Well, that's just ridiculous when you're talking about a technology that's emerging. Of course there's no data because it's never been done before. So, you know, there is common sense. You can apply common sense to certain safety situations like shielded operations. You know, another one that always bothered me was the wind farm inspections. No helicopter is going to be flying through a damn wind farm. Let them fly within a wind farm and they're going to be okay. You know, they're not going to hit some random helicopter flying through a wind farm. It was just the most ridiculous denial things that I've ever seen. So it's really good to see some common sense opening up inside of the FAA rather than trying to apply just straight data and quantitative measures because they don't exist. And so it's, you know, that's again, from that operations perspective though, that's kind of how we think. So, yeah.
And I had another thing to add to, you mentioned common sense a couple times there, Brandon. That's what I always cite for where the state of ground risk mitigations are.
Sure.
You know, air risk is certainly a little bit more of a kind of a blended strategy between, you know, strategic mitigations and tactical mitigations and technology, sometimes human, sometimes radar, sometimes cameras, sometimes Vantis, sometimes shielded. You know, it's a bit more of a complicated equation. But I think ground risk has come a long way just in common sense. You know, we've been able to provide, and not just us, but just speaking from us because I know us the best, we've been able to provide enough durability and reliability information to the agency over the years as a part of, you know, as an addendum to our, or an appendix, whatever the right word is, to our BV loss waivers. And we can incrementally request more and more from a population density threshold for flight over people, for flight over moving vehicles. You know, those are two waivers that we add into every BV loss waiver now is .39 and .145. And up until now, you know, the Centero 6 does have a parachute that we're going to put through ASTM certification, but up until now, we've never had a parachute on board. And we've incrementally grown the types of roads that we could cross, the how many lanes were on the road, what are the cars per minute. That has all gone up incrementally, and you can make an argument exponentially with each, you know, passing quarter, just by a common sense approach towards lowering ground risk. We are not going to fall out of the sky. Well, everything falls out of the sky at some point, but we are not likely to fall out of the sky. And if we do, what is our kinetic energy impact? You know, having, you know, thinking through a safety case, and this does tie into utilities. When you're flying even a transmission right away, forget distribution. Distribution was really hard to unlock from a drone perspective for something like us, you know, flying 50, 60 miles, now 100 miles, when you can't fly over people or moving vehicles, because being generally speaking more urban, distribution was kind of out. Drones like us were out in the middle of nowhere flying over the transmission right away for miles and miles and miles. Oh, but until you had to cross a road, then you had to land, reposition, launch on the other side, all because you couldn't spend the second and a half that it would take to cross that road in the middle of Kansas.
Of course, that's probably a lot more risk of the car driving up to pick up the drone and move it across the street.
So here's a couple things. And again, this was one of the mind-blowing, numbing conversations that I listened to, and I would not partake in it. But one of the denial criteria they said was they thought that if a drone was flying over a road, it would distract the driver and the driver would have a car accident. The first time I ever heard that, I'm like, you've got to be shitting me. I'm like, so we are going to put the responsibility of a car accident and a driver not paying attention driving on a drone that's flying overhead, and you're going to deny a safety case because of that? At that point, I started to get a little bit of the reputation I've got as a speak your mind kind of person in the FAA. And I'm like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And that is completely unacceptable for something to be doing. And again, people have moved because this is the type of stuff that was happening. And there's a culture of folks who don't want drones integrated. I'll tell you right now. And there's a lot of pilots out there that don't want drones integrated because it is change. Change is not easy. And, you know, I think finally, and Kyle, you tell me if I'm wrong on this, but the last like 3-ish years, maybe even the last 2, there's been just a difference in the atmosphere of drone integration and the propelling of what's been able to, or what's been achievable.
Yep.
It just for some reason, and I kind of know a little bit why, but it's been so awesome to see the advancement. On the flip side of that, where I typically live is on the security side, though. That exact same thing is happening on the illicit usage, especially in prisons and drug smuggling and cross-border stuff and targeting of the. So the technology, we are in an explosive state of emergence right now in this technology. And Kyle hit it I can't remember what you said, Kyle, but going back to the way the FAA always says is crawl, walk, run. We are, from a technology standpoint, we are in, I'd say, like a fast walk. We still haven't even touched like the true capability of this, and we won't until the regulations really start applying and they can apply this and say, hey, you know, now that we can go do these BV loss operations, wouldn't it be cool if we could do now X, Y, or Z? We don't even know what that X, Y, or Z is yet because we can't even get to, you know, MNLOP. So that's one of the things that's going to be really cool to see is where this technology goes. Probably in the next, I'd say 4 to 5 to 6 years, we're going to see some massive advancement, especially with all this AI and optical navigation aided systems and all these other stuff that are going to pull the human more and more out of in the loop and on the loop, where they're directing drones to go do a job rather than the human doing the job by using the remote as an extension of themselves.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, I don't know, I think we have 3 minutes left, David. I don't know how strict you are on the time frame here. I feel like Brandon and I can go for another hour, but
Easy.
to think about kind of starting this whole conversation with where we were, but talking about that flight 60 miles, bunch of humans, you know, probably weeks of planning and all this stuff. Where we're heading into because of the maturity and frankly, I got to tip my cap to the agency in many ways for green lighting certain projects, certain waivers that allow us to gather data on a safety case that proves its efficacy, proves certain mitigations as viable to then scale into other applications with other technologies layered in, tied in, et cetera. You know, going back to utilities, the thing that we're talking about more than anything with these guys these days is what are their inspection cycles historically across everything? Helicopters, walking, driving, drones, vendors, internal, you know, is it every 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is? How often do they understand their infrastructure? Pick a pole, any pole, pick a mile, any mile. When's the last time that got looked at? Whether it's from the air or from the ground. It's not uncommon for that answer to be years. And it's also not uncommon for to say, I don't know if we ever get out to that part of the service territory, unless there's a major issue or a storm or what have you. We have a customer where it's 10 years. Definitely won't name that utility, but they have a 10-year inspection cycle. As we implement solutions like this, like ours and other tools, and to your point, Brandon, there's none of this goes anywhere without the adoption of information disseminating tools like AI and machine learning, so that you're not consuming all this information, you're acting on what needs to be acted on. But, you know, as different parts of the industry have been working on different parts of technology for a while. Remote operations and dock solutions historically have just been a multi-rotor thing at the substation for, you know, bridge inspections or construction progress monitoring or whatever. As the bigger aircraft like us get into dock solutions, now we're talking about bringing that 10-year inspection cycle down to 30 days. We know everything about our grid every 30 days. What a crazy place to be when we were flying with 60 humans along the right of way as VOs, you know, 6 years ago. Everybody wants the agency to work quicker and be better. Nobody wants to have their taxes hiked up to give them more resources to do it. You know, I'm not saying I'm an FAA fanboy here or anything, but I think they do great work for the resources they have and the trust that they've been given over the years and the trust they've earned to keep the national airspace safe and to keep people and property on the ground safe. They've done a pretty dang good job of that over many decades. And we're introducing more things flying around in the national airspace than ever before, commercially and recreationally, that they're expected to maintain that safety level. So I think there's a natural tension against progress and safety, like there always will be in every industry for the history of time.
Yeah, 100%. And that goes back to the change. A lot of folks didn't want change for a good reason. It's because it's safe now. We don't want to change it, right? Like don't mess with what we already have built over the last 100 years. And like, look, this is happening. You got to figure it out. And so, and I get it. And I'll tell you that they're having the exact same struggle right now with counter UAS. How do you integrate counter UAS technology into a civil environment? These are weapon systems. So, folks go back to, well, we already do that with, integrated air defense systems. Like, no. You're talking about a full scale attack from like Russian strategic bombers. This is very different. This is like, how do I protect my Texas, high school football game that apparently football is big in Texas. I don't know if anybody knew that or not, but like these crowds with like 10,000, 15,000, people at a high school game. Unbelievable. Like, how do you protect and integrate counter UAS technology into that? And also integrate all these legitimate drone uses and not have collateral effects on all those systems. So it's an unbelievably complicated problem. No matter what decision you make, you're hitting another domino and hoping the whole thing just doesn't fall apart. And hope is not a way to do safety. And that's why they want quantitative and qualitative analysis on all of this stuff. And a lot of that time takes build. And Kyle, it's fantastic to hear that they're more accepting of that data that you've been able to collect you yourself, and they're not relying on, completely I'm trying not to name any third-party sources that they typically rely on as government source data, but also just the data that you as a company is providing them. That's great.
And it sounds like that's part of the reason you're getting those extensions. Partly is just that you're able to say every quarter by quarter that you have successful flights that are safe. They go, well, great. Now it's been so many years, X number of years, plus another year that thing's never fallen out of the sky and hit a car. Sounds like that's helping just in that, because of common sense, and be like, all right, guess you can fly over 3 lanes of traffic, not just 2 now, because it's probably about the same amount of safety or whatever, or risk, and so that's hats off.
And David, I know you're running a little long, but and again, it's the FAA over the last 2-3 years have been saying, we need you to prove you're safe. We are going to give you the latitude to prove it. There's risk in aviation. Aviation's dangerous. So let us take some risk to prove that we are safe. And that's what's happening right now. And it's awesome to see.
Good point. I guess that kind of defines like entrepreneurship in general and capitalism. And, the way our country was structured was individuals and small organizations can take on risk to innovate. Right. And so that's really cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, you guys, both of you, and Michelle, and everyone listening and interacting. I really appreciate you. We couldn't do this without you. And for many of us, we'll meet up in person again here in a couple weeks on the 16th, 17th, 18th in Houston at the Energy Drone and Robotics Conference. We got the $200 off registration for friends of the podcast. You can see at the bottom of the screen, go to that landing page, thisweekindrones.com/connect to get that $200 off and to connect to the community. So otherwise, thanks again. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place.